Meeting come to order. Today is Tuesday, February 2nd, 2016. This is a study session meeting for the Prescott City Council. I'd like to welcome everybody that decided to come out and join us today and find out a little bit about what we're going to be talking about. You know, as you probably know, because you're here, that we started a new schedule. We're going to start doing workshops and voting meetings on the same day, and it'll be the first and third Tuesdays of the month, which is a change from what we used to do. We have a number of items today that we're going to be talking about. They're very preliminary, and so I'm not going to take any public discussion today during this workshop because these subjects are going to be coming up again in the future, some of them several times, and at that time I'll go ahead and ask for public discussion. Roll call, please.
Mayor Oberg.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Lamberson.
Here.
Councilman Blair.
Here.
Councilman Lazell.
Here.
Councilwoman Orr is absent excused. Councilman Shiska.
Here.
And Councilwoman Wilcox is absent excused. You have a quorum.
Okay, first item, please.
Item 1A, presentation of the mid-year 2016 budget report and a preliminary look at the fiscal year 2017.
Thank you, Dana. Mayor and Council, this is our mid-year budget report. Obviously, throughout the year, staff monitors budget weekly, monthly, and but once a year we come back to give you a summary as we are halfway through the year. So looking at this point through the end of December, halfway through the year, we have added a few columns to this slide from previous presentations. We've added the 15 actual, so you can have an idea where we ended up last year, the budget for 16, and of course through December of 15. We also separated operations into two categories, personnel and non-personnel, to give an idea. As we look across, you can see personnel were about 44.4% spent. Not a bad percentage, of course. Looking at the year, we have an uneven distribution of the paydays. In the second half of the year, we actually have one more payday. So we've had 46% of the paydays so far this year. So when you consider that number should be close to 46, we're right on track. It's a little low, as you will see as we go through different funds. Part of that is due to turnover. Some areas have had significant turnover, and that, of course, reduces the spending compared to what we budgeted. Capital obviously is well below at 17%, but again, that has to do with when the projects are scheduled to be done, a lot more in the spring of the year, although some of the projects will be multiple years and will be carried over into the next year. But overall, we're at $47,483,308 through the end of December of our $148 million budget. As we go through this, feel free to interrupt me on any slide if you have a question. We can take it right then. The distribution of the city budget, this is the same slide we used during the creation of the budgets. Just in here as a reminder, 55% of our operations are governmental, 45 are enterprise. And of course, the enterprise are our business type functions, our water, wastewater, solid waste, airport, and golf course. Also, this is a slide that we use during the regular budget, but it gives you a good indication of the general fund. As we always talk about, the general fund is the fund that a lot of stuff happens in, but there's really no dedicated revenue sources in it. There are funding sources, which we'll talk about. This slide represents the departments in the general fund net of their program revenues, which is their direct revenue. So in relation to fire, it would be any direct revenues that the fire department has, joint fire agreements, training classes like CPR. We net those out to give a true cost of what percentage of the tax base is being spent on fire, police, and so on. As you can see on the left side of this slide, we have 80.6% of our general fund is personnel. So that is why whenever we talk about having to reduce the general fund, you're talking about reducing personnel, which is reducing services. And of course, 75% overall is public safety of the general fund. Looking at detail of the individual departments in the general fund, You can see that everybody is doing a great job of staying under budget, but the finance department. No, that as we look at that, a lot of our expenses are preloaded in the year. Most specifically, what's pushing us over there is the payment to DOR, the $116,000 that they had to have by the end of September for the whole year. That's not cost recovered because it is for the collection of revenues in the general fund, so that's what's pushing us over the 65 or over the 50% there. Rodeo ground parking garage has a lot of maintenance. That's why it's low. I'm sure that maintenance will be happening in the second half of the year. The rest of the funds, except for economic enterprises, which is where special events were, is well below the 50%. And the issue there, or the item there, is the 4th of July is their most significant expense area of the year. And it was, of course, at the beginning of the year, since our years go from July 1 to June 30. So we don't anticipate any of these divisions at this time being over budget by the time we get to the end of the year. Capital projects, again, are dependent on when they can be scheduled, and of course they're at 8% here. Major capital project in there that hasn't gotten too far underway yet is a replacement of the computer-aided dispatch system. So overall, 43%. Looking at the revenues, good news here. Sales tax is coming in well above the projection, which is always the preferred way of seeing it. We're at 56%. Our sales tax collection is pretty evenly distributed throughout the year as far as first half and second half of the fiscal year. Although our months do vary, we do generally get about 50% through the first 6 months and 50% through the last 6 months. So we're good at a 56 there. Franchise fees are a little more skewed to the spring of the year. And then property tax is also skewed to the fall of the year because that's the first collection, and a lot of people pay their whole property tax up front. The intergovernmental revenues, which are a significant part, and just to point out on this slide, the far column to the right gives you a percentage that particular revenue is of the general fund's revenue as a whole. So local collected sales and use tax is 40%, 41% of the whole general fund. Again, state shared revenues are coming in right where we'd expect them to be. State sales tax is unlike ours. It is skewed more to the spring, so we get generally a bigger chunk of that in the spring of the year. Vehicle license is pretty evenly distributed. And of course, income tax has a 2-year delay, so we know exactly what we're getting in state shared income tax. Joint dispatch is related to the expenses, and the library district is a spring of the year revenue. We get that from the district in March, I believe. And the fire contract is throughout the year. We are seeing growth in license and permits and service charges. Those are like our building permits, our inspection fees, and those things, with additional pickup there, as well as Parks and Rec fees, and those are increasing there. Overall, our revenues are at 50.3. You can see that financing for the computer-aided dispatch system. If we pull that out of the percentage, our revenues would actually be at 51.7. So good position to be in at this point of the year. We're happy with them. We don't see any reason to be concerned. We talked a lot about fund balance, so we're going to spend some time on fund balance as we go through this mid-year. This is just a recap of the general fund, looking at the different transfers out, the transfers in from the bed tax to the general fund, the transfers out to the airport and other grants. As you can see, we have a net increase in the fund balance of $2,180,000 for the first 6 months of the year. We're budgeting the year as a whole to be down using a portion of our fund balance at 1.2 million, 1.3 right there. So right now, as we said, we have 30,156,538 in fund balance. We were budgeted for year end to have around 27 million in fund balance. A little more detail on the next slide related to that fund balance. There's 2 reserve policies that the council has in place. Both of those, of course, are intact in that amount. We have a 10% for unanticipated shortfalls of expenditures to revenues. You know, if you have an event I always use 9/11. When we had 9/11, sales tax fell significantly for 4 months after 9/11. You still needed to put police on the street. You still needed to, keep the lights on in the facilities. That's what that shortfall is there in case something comes up. It gives us the cash to be able to keep operations going as things sort themselves out. There's another 10% reserve for timing of distributions. A lot of things are front-loaded in the year as opposed to back-loaded, so that allows some cushion in cash so that you can take care of business as you operate through the year. That gives us total reserve per the policy, council policy, of 20%. It's not a huge percentage. We're talking 20% of the general fund, so it's a big number. But if you need to operate, something happens to your cash flow, you're not going to be able to operate a long time on that. Also in the fund balance are other items that really aren't available because they're being used for operations across the city. For instance, the golf course operating deficit from the last few years. That's pretty much come about since 2002 to current. That 4.3 million is not 1 year, but that's a cash loan to the golf course to keep it solvent. Not really available cash. You can't spend it because it's not in cash form, even though it sets in the fund balance, in that $30 million fund balance. We also have delayed reimbursement on grants. That's a variable amount. It's a short-term, 3-month type of thing. And then there's a structured loan that was entered into a few years ago with the Water and Wastewater Fund for the refunding of a bond, and that still has $800,000 on it. That pays off in the next 2 years, I believe, so that will go away then. We also have a reserve for retirement liability. A few years ago, we changed the vacation and sick leave and retirement bonus program with the city and went to a PTO program. There was provision for the employees who were eligible, or how council adopted that. There are employees that are still eligible for that, so we need to reserve that because it is a liability we're going to have to pay out at some time. So again, that's not available. So that gives us an unassigned, which is an unassigned fund balance, which is available for one-time type expenditures. It's a savings account type of account where it's budgeted at about $12 million at the end of this fiscal year. Right now, halfway through, since we haven't had the capital in the general fund happen, there's currently 15 million, 15.3 in that. With that, we'll move on to the next fund, unless there's any questions on the general fund. Streets and Open Space Fund. Of course, we all know with the new ballot initiative, as of January 1, the street sales tax is only available for street maintenance. It's no longer available to be split between streets and open space. But of course, we had the first 6 months of the year and we have a fund balance. So at this point, we're still calling it Streets and Open Space Fund. We might be renaming it as we go through the budget process this year. As you can see with the other one, sales tax is coming in good. Highway user revenue is coming in good. You generally see better performance in highway user revenue as gas prices fall, because that's a so much per gallon tax as opposed to a value tax. So with gas prices down, people use more gas. There's more tax revenue from that. The partners reimbursements are related to capital projects. Our streetlight fee is on the utility bills, and of course that's right at 50 because it's pretty easy to estimate. And then we have miscellaneous earnings are around 50 there. The majority of that large miscellaneous at 568 is related to a Build America bond that we did a few years ago for the Williamson Valley Road project, where we get a rebate from the federal government for a portion of the interest cost, and that represents the majority of that $500,000 each year. Again, we split on this fund. We also split out personnel from non-personnel to give a better idea of what operations are really doing. And debt service is on these bonds. There's 2 bonds in this fund, one for the interchange out on 89A and one for Williamson Valley Road, and they pay principal in June, and that's why they're only at 24%. It's just the timing of those payments. The budgeted open space projects were $730,000 this year, and that was the 2 projects that were brought forward through the budget, the project at Goldwater Lake and $230,000 for right-of-way across state land for trails. And then the other projects, other capital projects, $23 million. We go over those in detail as we do the budget each year. So in the mid-year, we just kind of look at them as in whole. And again, timing on those projects is dependent on the weather, and also some of those will lapse into other years. Some miscellaneous transfers in. The transfer in is from our streets impact fee, and then the transfer out is related to the time and attendance program, which is budgeted in the general fund. Again, we're looking at fund balance because it's been of interest. So with that, through the end of December, we have a $2.7 million change in our fund balance in this fund, bringing the fund balance as of December 31st of 2015 at $22,633,197. We budgeted, of course, if all the capital projects happen, we would be at $5.5 million at the end of the year. Any question on streets and open space? Next fund we'll look at is the transient occupancy tax, which of course is the bed tax. This year we moved the liquor license, which has a similar restriction on spending. It can only be spent for tourism related activities. We moved that revenue into this fund. Excuse me, as you can see, bed tax is coming in good, well above projections. Like sales tax, economic activity is increasing in the community. Liquor license are billed once a year, mostly in December. They do trickle in January. That's why you have that at 96%.
Mark?
Yes, sir.
The liquor license, is that anybody that sells liquor retail or serves it? I mean, how does
Yes.
that? Both.
Somebody
So if I'm
who needs a liquor license.
If I own a Circle K or a dance hall, you got to get one.
If you serve liquor, you have to get one.
Okay.
Then the different projects that we budget in this fund, including tourism, which was moved to this fund this year as part of the 16 budget process. Those are our projects that are out there. As you can see, some have been done and some are for the spring of the year. Going down, right now we're at a $64,000 change in fund balance. We budgeted to actually use up some of the fund balance. We try to use the balance in this fund for the purpose that it was elected for on an annual basis. So we're at $447,000 at the end of December. And we'll again budget for the new revenues next year and also look at using up that fund balance as we get through the 17 budget process. Any other questions on bed tax? Impact fees, looking at the impact fees, these are the governmental impact fees, not the water or wastewater impact fees. Those are kept track of in those enterprise funds. So none of these impact fees are still being collected. They were all phased out with the new legislative rules and going through the process. None of these still exist, but they do have balances in them. So we did present them with the fund balance, as you can see, and we'll focus more on fund balance. Parks has a fund balance of $74,000 approximately. Yes, they are switched. I think those are probably switched. Yeah, we'll get back to you on that. I don't have it handy here, but it looks like we might have a switch there. I think Parks is actually higher than that, but we'll check and give you council an update on that one. And the only thing budgeted in these governmental impact fees this year is $10,000 in the Parks impact fee for a picnic expansion. Other governmental funds include the grants fund. Again, that's budgeted at $4.8 million. That is a high number. We will not get $4.8 million, but the issue is many grants come up throughout the year and you need to put in an application for them. If you don't have the appropriation in governmental budgeting, you can't spend the money. So we do put a little anything possible that we might get throughout the year in this fund. Obviously, it is not spent unless the grant is received. So The Acker Trust Fund budget's $10,000 a year, and those awards usually come in the spring of the year. The miscellaneous gifts and donations are throughout the year. We budget total available monies in those every year in case they need to be spent, and those are gifts to the library, to the parks, the Shop with the Cop program, programs like that where people give the city money for a specific purpose. And then, of course, our debt service fund deals with our purchase of our lakes, the only GO debt that the city still has outstanding, and one special assessment district that we have outstanding. So it's a relatively small fund.
Mark, I know that we're missing a couple council members here, but the lake acquisition, that was not done with the open space money, correct?
Correct. That was done well before open space was passed, and it was done with a separate election to purchase the lakes through a GO bond, general obligation bonds, that was on people's property tax bill.
Okay, thank you.
Getting into our enterprise funds now. The Water Enterprise Fund, obviously water revenues are coming in at 48. It's been a wet year. That's a little below where we'd expect it to be, but nothing to be concerned about. It's very dependent on the weather on the water. There was also a rate increase in water went into effect on the February bills, so we'll see a little bit more. It was a 2% increase council adopted a couple of years ago. They adopted 3 increases at the time. Water connections are up at 61. The miscellaneous earnings are up. The impact fees are not at the projection. These projections that we have there came out of the study, the rate study that we did, and that's just probably a timing issue. As construction starts to pick up, we'll probably see those pick up a little bit. It's really hard to project an accurate number in water and wastewater, for that matter, impact fees anymore, because we now have 10 or 11 districts in each of these, and they each have a different rate. So it's not only a projection of will construction happen, but where in the city will construction happen varies this much. So some of the districts are relatively small in fee, and some of them are much higher. The draws on the WIFA loan weren't budgeted, but it was a continuation of a loan that was in place. The intergovernmental contributions relate to the Big Chino and the agreement for the monitoring and modeling out in that area. Those come in the spring of the year from SRP and Prescott Valley. The operating expenses, about what we've seen in the other funds. Personnel is around 44. Again, 46 would be where it would be if it was exactly right. Debt service, again, dependent on the timing of the loan payments. The capital projects are low because of the timing of those projects. With that, I'd be glad to answer any more specific questions in water. Wastewater, again, similar. Wastewater, of course, is billed at the winter average, so the rates are set every May. We also had a rate increase that goes into effect February 1st. In wastewater, it's more significant. It's closer to a 5% increase this month. So we will see more collected in the second half of the year. You can see a big increase in miscellaneous earnings there, miscellaneous and interest. That's related to the APS rebates that Public Works was able to get for the replacement of several motors and other things through APS. Again, wastewater impact fees were set, budget was set at the amount of the study. Again, it's very hard with the 11 different districts that are out there to get an exact amount on that. The WIFA, the loan there is related to the wastewater treatment plant, which is finishing up here pretty soon. Just a few minor things to close out that loan. And personnel is significantly lower here, well below the 44 that we see most of the other funds, or the 46, related to turnover. They've had some turnover in the wastewater fund and treatment operators and those type of things, and that really does impact the expending for personnel. Of course, it increases the spending for training and those other things. But debt service, of course, depending on when those amounts are due. Any questions on wastewater? Moving on to solid waste. As you can see, solid waste is, above budget on their revenues at 52%, with 50% of the year done. Transfer station, of course, is up as well. That's very dependent, of course, on who goes through the transfer station. But as you see increase in economic activity, you see, obviously, we'll see an increase in dumping and those type of things. The recycling revenue is down. Talking to solid waste, the issue there is a lot of the prices have fallen significantly. They're tied to the oil price. So as oil prices go down, recycling rates that you're able to get for your recyclables goes down. However, it's still a good program in that if we recycle it, we don't have to pay the transfer station fees, the tipping fees at the landfill for it. So still a good program. The miscellaneous revenue is high there related to proceeds from auction of an old vehicle. Auction an old vehicle, and again, their operating personnel is about 44, what we're seeing pretty much across the city. And their other expenses are within line. They're doing a little bit better project, getting their capital projects done than a lot of the other funds. Any questions on solid waste? Looking at the airport, they're tied down. Their revenues are coming in pretty much as expected. Fleet fuel flowage is a little down. Not a huge revenue for the fund, but it's an important revenue, like all. Miscellaneous earnings are up. Miscellaneous income is up, primarily from two functions. We had a payment from insurance settlement related to some damage out there, and we also had a one-time transfer fee related to the transfer of a hangar title out there, which brings that well above what was budgeted. But again, those are more one-time type revenues and not something that you can look to reoccur. On the operating expense side, the ARF truck, the fire truck out there, well below budget at 31. Talking to the fire department, they're reviewing that to make sure that we are getting the hours that are being worked on that ARF truck charged to that expense, and we'll be working on that as we get into the second half of this year. Their personnel are also below the 44 or the 46% that you'd expect. That's related to whenever there is a capital grant project that hours can be charged to per the grant documents. Airport will do that, which will move those personnel costs out of the operations and put them against those grant projects, and then we get reimbursed from the federal government for those dollars. So it's a good program, but again, it does show budget below there. With that, you have their capital projects and the grant projects down below, which of course are dependent on award of grants, and then our share on those. Any questions on the airport?
One, Mark.
Yes, sir.
Landing fees, is there a reason that we didn't anticipate so many landings, or people just taking off and not coming back?
Is John here? I didn't see if John came in. I'll have to get back to you on that. I get those budget amounts from the airport, so I'll have to follow up, and I'll follow up as well with those impact fee numbers that we will get you guys. All right, the next fund is the golf course fund. As council will remember, a year ago, 2 years ago, I think it was about we went with Billy Casper 2 years ago. This spring we went with outsourcing the operations of the course with Billy Casper. So as we look at the comparison, and here I'm not comparing to budget because budget's a hard number on this operation because we don't have a lot of history with the new management out there. So what I'm doing is comparing it to last year, which was also run by Billy Casper. So as we look at the change, you'll notice it's down. You'll notice revenues are down from last year. There are a couple factors. They've been struggling with some weather out there and closure of the course and a few things like that we'll talk about on the later slides. But yeah, there are some issues that Joe and Billy Casper are working on to resolve to make this operation run as smoothly as possible. Meet with them often to try to make sure we're moving in the right direction on all these things. We split the presentation here to the first slide, slide 17, which is basically the operations of the course, the green fees, and the operation of the course that way. And then the second slide, the first part of it is the restaurant, which of course has an increase in revenues, but also has an issue with some costs that are increasing a little bit too much. Which again, we're working with Billy Casper to try to get those under control. And my next slide has a few comments on each of these things. The maintenance is still run by the city. That's towards the bottom half of the page. That is up some maintenance projects that went on in the fall of the year, tree trimming and a few things like that, which were out of the ordinary. That's why we have that a little higher there. Debt service, you'll see, is way down, and that's because our golf carts paid off this year. So the only debt service they really have is the interest payments on that internal loan to the general fund, which is at a very competitive rate, as you can see, with half a year at $2,759. It's per council policy. The rate that is charged to funds who owe the general fund money is based on the LGIP, or the local government investment pool, at the state treasurer's office, which is about 0.08% right now. And then the internal charges are for the IT, the HR, the accounting, those type of functions that are done out there. We still run all their computer network and that kind of stuff for them. So some of the points to talk about here with the golf course are obviously 17 days this year lost due to weather compared to 2 days. That impacted revenues about $55,000. Billy Casper's in the process of looking at rate changes out at the golf course to also help resolve some of these issues. Maintenance has implemented a $42,000 mid-year budget reduction to bring their cost, down from what was budgeted by the end of the year. The Advantage card, which is a player card out there, are increasing the price of that, bringing another $13,000. And there has been a food price increase, and I know they are working on other issues with the restaurant to bring it into a more profitable position. With that, Joe Baines, of course, is here with Recreation Services if we have any more specific questions on the golf course. If not, we'll move on to internal service funds. City has 4 internal service funds, one related to Public Works Engineering Fund. As you can see, it's running at a significant deficit this year. We've been working with them the last couple months to reset their rates that they're charging, and we have done that, and they have implemented those rates, and in the second half of the year they will be going back and updating those charges that were made in the first half of the year to the individual projects to help resolve this deficit. In addition to that, we're taking additional steps there to make sure that all hours that inspectors and project managers are working are being charged to the accurate projects. So obviously it's an issue right now, but it's an issue that we are resolving and will have resolved in the next month or two. The fleet facility is done based on charges, based on the services provided to the different facilities. It's above expenditures at this point. Obviously, a lot of that money is accumulated for maintenance, replacement of carpet where needed and things like that, painting and HVAC and those things. So that's in good shape this year. Fleet, the fleet services is of course our central fleet maintenance facility. And again, they've struggled the last few years with the debt of their new facility out there. The debt payments come in the second half of the year. they're doing a pretty good job with that. They're constantly looking at their rates and their charges there. The risk management area is showing a negative. A lot of that is related to two things. We went to the pool about 3 years ago, the risk pool, risk retention pool. So the risk management fund is being resized or phased down, if you will, as we resolve the issues that existed prior to going to the pool. Workers' comp will still be there because those stick around forever, even though we're with the pool now. The items that came about before we went to the pool are there. The deficit here is primarily due to just a timing issue of when the insurance coverage is paid for and when the proceeds are collected back from the individual departments. And on top of that, we are also trying to pull down any excess balance in that risk management fund to work on phasing that out in the next few years since we are no longer self-insured. So that'll be an issue as we get through this budget or the next budget. So with that, we usually take this time to look ahead at some issues as we're going into the next budget year. Obviously, pension costs. We've talked a lot about pension costs. We have the numbers for 2017. The state retirement is going up 0.01%, so that's a pretty level increase there, so we don't expect much of an increase in costs there. Public safety, we adopted the 3-year phase-in when we started this year, fiscal year 16. So the option as we go into 17 and 18 is to continue that phase-in or go to the full actuarial rate. So I presented both options here. Obviously, police is going up to 72% of employees' pay, and fire is going up to 76% of employees' pay if you would go to the full actuarial rate. So if we go to the full rate, we'd be looking at a $1.2 million increase in retirement costs. Most of those, basically all of those, in the general fund because they're related to police and fire. That's obviously a challenge. If council decides to continue the phase-in for the next 2 years, again, we opted that this year, that would be an increase of $627,000. Still a big increase, but obviously less than the 1.2. Class and compensation study, the market study that council looked at a while ago. Just a few comments on that, and again, just general comments. We'll be getting into more detail of the market rates as we move in through the budget process this year. But with the budget challenges of the last years, obviously employee pay has not moved. There has been issues with that. It's well below market because of that, causing non-competitive retention, compression, and employee turnover challenges. You know, losing trained employees increases training costs significantly all across the organization, and especially in like public safety when you have police officers that have to go to the police academy and then they're trained and then they move on. You have that the whole time, that training, but across our organization as a whole, whether it's police, whether it's wastewater treatment plant, or whether it's accountants. It's everywhere there's a training cost that this turnover is costing us. Implementation of the market competitive compensation plan has been identified by council as a priority in fiscal 17, so we'll be talking about it a lot, I'm sure, over the next 6 months as we get through the process. The proposed plan, as discussed and presented by the consultants, would set the midpoint of a salary range. There's an entry, a mid, and a max on a salary range. It would set that midpoint at the market competitive level of our benchmark cities. So if all the cities are paying this job at $20,000 or whatever it is, that would be the midpoint that position is here. So people would come in at entry, which would be well below that market value, and then they would move from that entry to the midpoint, that market value. And the way we projected these costs for this initial presentation is to move for 6 years from entry to midpoint to get to market. That would be about 3% a year. And then after they get to market, it would be strictly merit-based increases from there, anywhere from 0 to 3, depending on growth of the employee and the merit of the individual employees. First initial estimates, as we look at that and we contemplate it for the going forward, for all funds across the city, we'd need about $2.5 million to implement that plan. That's on a $44 million personnel budget, to keep it in perspective. As estimated annually to maintain that program, because it doesn't do you any good to implement it and then start to get behind again by not giving raises. So you need some way to maintain the program to keep employees at market so you can stop the turnover. Would be about $800,000 for a full year for that implementation. Of course, initial year is less.
Mayor, if I could interject here, we will be presenting to the Council, Human Resources Department will be presenting to Council at the next study session, which is on February 16th, with respect to more details of implementing classification and compensation study. So you'll see how these amounts were calculated and get a better idea of how this would work.
So looking at that and putting it in sort of a spreadsheet, if you will, looking at next year, looking just at the general fund here, we have the mid-year adjustments, which Council adopted and went into effect January 1, brings in an additional $1,041,000. There is proposed fee increases and changes in cost recovery methodologies for fiscal 17 that were part of that thing as well. Those things will be coming to Council over the next 3 or 4 months as we get close to the new year. That's anticipated bringing in another $891,000 in the general fund. We have potential of a health insurance increase of probably less than 5% for employee health insurance. That will impact employees as well as their share goes up as well, but the cost of the city share going up in the general fund may be around $100,000. The increased pension cost, and here we put it in at the PSPRS full actuarial rate at the 1.2. The class and comp implementation, we mentioned it was 2.5. Well, 1.6 of that is in the general fund. Not a surprise. A lot of the compression is in the public safety, which is in the general fund. The continuation of the compensation program in fiscal 17, again, partial year because it's done on an employee anniversary date, is $260,000. So that gives us a current, I don't hate to use the word shortfall, but we'll call it a challenge of $1,244,000 with these known factors at this time. Still unknown is, and again, we always wait for 7 or 8 months of sales tax activity in a year to try to project next year's sales tax increase. But as we discussed, it is very positive, so we would be looking at an increase there, which can help reduce that challenge, if you will. Distribution of state shared revenue, there's some legislation related to how that's distributed in relation to changing populations since Prescott's not growing as quick as other communities. We're not sure what that'll mean yet because we know that'll be a negative increase for Prescott, but we also don't know the increase in those revenue sources altogether. So whether it'll be less than the prior year or just less of an increase than other cities are seeing is yet to be seen, and we'll know that in the next few months. And then any other possible state changes to the tax base, we've talked about some of those during legislative update, getting rid of construction sales tax, getting rid of residential rentals, all those would be devastating, of course, to our general fund. They'd be millions of dollars a year. So with that, to wrap up, we have the budget process for 2017. The items in red are public workshops. We've already had the departmental kickoff. Departments are working on their budgets and various things. We have this mid-year budget presentation where it's kind of where we are and some of the high points of what's coming up. Other deadlines for the departments are listed there as well. Then our council workshops will be in May. We usually have 2 of those. And then the budget adoption and publishing and all that will happen in June with the property tax coming in July. With that, I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Mr. Woodfield,
Yes, sir.
you kept asking for questions, and I probably could have given you a lot of good questions if I could have seen this a little earlier. I'm new to this process. Does this happen is this the way things go, where you present it to us and in a meeting like this?
Generally, that's the way we present it. Definitely would be glad to take any questions that you may have at a future date. If you want to email those questions to me, or if you'd rather come back at a public meeting and do it, whatever council would desire to do there.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Okay, let's move on.
Item 2B, presentation and council direction on the implementation of a city business license.
Thank you, Dana. Mayor and council, are you sick of hearing me talk yet? Going to go over business license. It was discussed as we looked at the budget shortfall and different ideas moving into the fiscal 17 budget. So we have an introductory presentation and a timeline that we'll be getting to as we go through the next few months. Obviously, a business license or registration is for all businesses in a municipality to get current locations, public safety information, any other important information council is interested in. Obviously, a useful tool for compliance with zoning or building safety and building databases for knowing what's going on within the city. Currently, we only have the transaction privilege tax license, which is a one-time fee, $25 people pay as long as they keep their license current. It's intact. If you are not required to pay transaction privilege tax, you do not have a license. So medical offices, real estate, financial, engineers, anything that is just a service, barbers, any of those things are not licensed. We have no record of those businesses in the city, where they are, what they're doing. With centralized TPT administration, which we've talked about going to the Department of Revenue, the TPT licenses for Prescott will be handled through DOR, and we will still get that information from DOR. But that DOR centralization, many of the non-program cities, which are the cities that do their own administration right now, like Prescott, there's 15 of them. Many of those cities already have a business license in place for that database, and the 4 that do not, that 4 does include Prescott. The other 3 have significant other licenses. They have amusement licenses, liquor licenses, pawn licenses, several licenses. I didn't list them all here, but they have many other licenses. Of course, Prescott does not. We have a liquor license, but.
Yeah, and I just want to make one comment, and we've made this many times before, but we're still receiving emails that are mixing together a business license, a proposal for a business license, and then a business tax. So one I saw today was, please don't adopt a business tax license, which is really 2 things. Let's make it clear there's a separation, and what we're talking about today is adopting a business or presenting information about potential adoption of a business license. It is not a business license, is not a business tax, which levies an amount of tax on different types of businesses in some kind of scheme or configuration. This, as Mark will indicate, is a registry for the purposes which he has already outlined here on basically a cost recovery basis. This business license program is not for the generation of tax revenue.
So with that, looking at the TPT statistics, which we have, just to give you an idea of what's going on in the community for what we can tell, looking at the NICS codes, rentals, of our 8,300 licenses, 3,500 of those are related to rental properties. 2,000 are related to retail, and we list there whether it's businesses located within the city, within the state, or out of state, but selling here. Contractors, of course, pretty significant. Of course, those are the contractors located here or located within the state but doing jobs here or out of state. And then others make up the other. The chart on the bottom is, I find interesting, is the number of licenses per each area taxable activity for the year. So as you look there, we have about 1,000 licenses that bring in about 93% of all of our sales tax revenue. That's 12% of our overall tax licenses bring in 93% of our revenue. Just an interesting statistics. And then we have several, as you can see on the bottom, at zero, that never report any tax revenue. They just have an active tax account, which could mean they're had a job here as a contractor, but they keep the account active month after month, year after year, in case they have another job here. Because of course, if you cancel it, it's another $25 to get it going again. We talked a little bit about the purposes. Obviously, economic information, number of type business, geographic locations. You could get trend reports, migration of businesses in and around town, in, out of town. Like we do with the tax activity, we do some maps that show where the taxable activity is happening. You know, that would help economic development, I'm sure, having a more accurate business recruiting tool.
Question?
Yes, sir.
Because you guys probably talk about it when we're not around, but how much seepage do you believe we have within this community where we have businesses that should be taxed and are not taxed? And in other words, from my standpoint, when you start talking about a residential facility that went from a single-family residential and all of a sudden becomes a drug and alcohol house that is now a business, in my opinion, where they have 6 people in the house that are paying rent, and the owner of that house is now a business operator, not a homeowner. How many of those facilities are we missing out on getting bed tax and as well as property tax differentiation on those?
Well, it's hard to tell what we're missing out on. Obviously, whenever we find a property like that or made aware of a property like that, we proceed with enforcement efforts, with going out and making sure they're licensed, doing desk reviews or audits, more desk reviews, getting with the business owner, getting them to report their activity and getting them licensed. So how many are we missing? I'm sure we're missing some.
So this is a principle of us trying to gather some of those lost revenues that this community may not be taking in. I know, and I'm speaking personally for myself, when I had apartments in Prescott Valley, I had to pay a business license tax because I was a businessman offering an opportunity for somebody to rent my property. And I think that we're missing a lot of those things in this community, as well as the ability to be able to recognize that people that want to locate in the city of Prescott and ask us how many doctors, dentists, lawyers, you know, whatever the case may be, how many we have no way to share that. And I've had people say, well, pick up a phone book and look. That's not the case anymore with cell phones and internet and social media. There's a lot of different advertising tools. So I think we're missing out on a lot. So I guess you can hear from my voice that I would support a business license because I think we're missing out.
We got a question here from the Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. That's why we have those buttons. Here again, I'm going to go back to number one. Generally speaking, I don't like the idea of registering somebody for permission to live in town and taxing them because they exist. What they do is a different issue sometimes. You know, if somebody's coming to town and going to do something that can put the public in harm's way, things like that. One of my areas of concern is, you know, we have zoning in the city of Prescott. Not that I ever agreed with zoning to begin with, but since we do it, you know, which steals the freedom of somebody to use their property the way they would choose, but since we do it and have since the early 50s, single-family residential doesn't necessarily mean single-family residential business, single-family residential internet business, single-family doctoring, a lot of these things are going on in zoning areas that were never intended for them to go on. And then, of course, you've got the other side of the coin because of the impaling of businesses with governmental rules and regulations, a lot of them have now transferred their operations to where it's a little bit more price friendly, which happens to be out of their homes, things like this. Is there a mechanism in place other than just in zoning and code enforcement for us to address you can't run a business out of your house and have your house classified as a residential house? It's not a residential house if you're running a retail business out of your front room or your garage, or you happen to be, I don't know, putting up signs or whatever the case would be out of your garage, running a sign business out of your backyard or whatever the case is. That house isn't being used as a house. It's being used as a business. Very similar to what Blair was saying, but I'm saying it from a different direction, because our houses in our residential neighborhoods are being used for a whole lot less or a whole lot more or a whole lot of something different than they were ever zoned for. For example, we had a bunch of people here trying to talk us into having a whole community of businesses in our residential neighborhoods called, I don't know, what were they, vacation rental homes. Let's just blanket the city with a whole bunch of renters all over this city at the grace of the city when people bought into single-family residential neighborhoods on purpose. Bringing that up, Mark.
Yes, Councilman. The obviously business license, when people apply for businesses, we do communicate with zoning and we send them to zoning for home occupancy to make sure they're zoned correctly. Outside of that, as far as compliance, it's a challenge with staffing levels. Obviously more complaint based. As people complain about a business, then code enforcement can look at it, or business or home can look at it and see if there's any issue there, but there is no other mechanism really out there.
And while I agree with your perspective that a business license isn't going to force somebody to comply, somebody who's going to cheat is going to cheat. They've been doing it since the beginning of time, so that's the way that works. I don't think it's necessary to impose a business license in a blanket perspective as much as it is to approach activity that people are using their property for. If their property was bought and intended to be bought for one use and now you're in there using it for something different, I think we ought to make the penalties pretty stiff. Very similar to, I don't have to register my vehicle in the city of Prescott or my gun in the city of Prescott. Nobody's denied me the freedom to have either one. But I can't go out there and do anything I want with either one of those two things, any more than you should be able to do it with your home. Just sharing that with you.
Thank you, Councilman.
Councilman Chiska.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Woodfill, is this going to require that we hire additional people in order to implement and maintain the program?
We're going to talk about that in a few slides as we get into it. It would depend on the structure of the license. We're kind of looking at it. This is a kickoff to the process where we'll be coming back to talk about exactly what you want to license, how you want to license. There's a lot of details that need to be worked out, but there would be a need. You know, you can't implement something without staff to operate it. We do have an issue with state taking over the transaction privilege tax administration, so there is some staff that could be reassigned. You know, those things will have to be worked out as we get down the road on the complexity of whatever license council ends up wanting us to implement and the speed at which the state actually gets their act together on centralization.
Okay, well, I'll be looking forward to the future slides. And again, I'm sorry I mispronounced your last name.
That's fine, Councilman. You can call me whatever you want.
I guess I'm concerned about what Jim said, because there's part of that I understand and part that I don't. I happen to work out of my home, and I pay city sales tax. I don't have people that come into my home where I provide them service in a residential neighborhood. But I work specifically out of my home for a reason, and that reason is real simple. Number one, I can keep the prices low. Number two, I don't care to have a showroom or employees or overhead, and I do pay my share of tax. I have a business license in the community and have for 30 years. I also think that if you're charging sales tax doing what you do outside of the home, that you should be paying sales tax. In other words, I'm not an Amway dealer, but my question would become, if you're working out of your home and you are an Amway dealer and you're charging tax, they should have to have a business license, from my perspective. But I think some people do work out of their home, and I think it's a righteous thing to do if you're not creating an issue with the neighborhood, with traffic or people in the neighborhood that are violating the people's right to live in a residential neighborhood. So although I agree with some of his philosophy on that, there's some that I do not, because I have always operated my business out of my home.
Councilman Lozelle.
Mayor, I'm going to hold off until after the presentation.
Continue.
Okay, good comments, and again, that's why, you know, the devil's in the details. What is a business license? What's the definitions and all that, which we'll get into here in just a few slides, not as to what it's going to be, but some of the details we have to work out over the next little bit of time. Obviously, public safety could utilize information, number and type of businesses, accuracy of contact information. With the business license, with our, transaction privilege tax license that we have, some people have had them for 30 years and moved 3 times. We might not have the most up-to-date phone numbers. We probably have the most up-to-date address because we mail them something all the time, but more, you know, the annual registration would allow that data to be more current. Any hazardous material, depending on what you ask on your forms, could be logged and tracked for public safety or fire if they're, depending on what the business is, if they might have something hazardous. All of these things really are not done now. There's no mechanism to know what's going on out there. Compliance tool, as Councilman Lamerson pointed out, to make sure the DOR is getting all the taxes, taxable activity licensed within Prescott. You know, they can get licensed with DOR, and DOR might, by some fluke, make an error and put them in PV instead of in Prescott. If we had a business license, we could be tying out that information and make sure that things are getting correctly recorded for the city of Prescott. And of course, facilitate zoning code compliance, which Councilman Lamerson was talking about, changing uses of these properties.
I have another question when we talk about compliance, because it brings up to mind, you have people, and I'm not speaking about you, Mr. Blair, so don't take it personal on me. You have people that have chemicals that are not only toxic, but they're hazardous, equipment that's hazardous, gases and all kinds of things in this community, all through this community, being used out of properties that were never intended by zoning to be used for that purpose. There's a reason why, for example, you probably wouldn't want to have, well, I don't know, a chicken farm in the middle of downtown Prescott. Well, there's probably a reason you wouldn't want to have a whole bunch of other types of things in the middle of any neighborhood in the city of Prescott, including some of the things that cause some of these flash fires, paint thinners, and all kinds of stuff that are being used out of. And while you may have a right to do certain things in your private home, you don't have a right to expose the other people in the city to the damage that you choose to expose them to.
Thank you, Councilman. Good comments, all of them. Obviously, policy considerations as we work through this, you can tell from the discussion so far, everybody, you know, has some idea, maybe a little bit different idea of what should be taxed and what shouldn't. How are we going to activity should happen? What's the definition of business activity? You know, those things need to be worked out. How do you license a physical location versus a firm that doesn't have a physical location but, you know, has business transactions within the city? When the separate licenses are required, is it each location? If you have, if you want to tax rentals and you have 5 rentals, do you need a separate license for each location, or do you need one license? If we're going to be able to track anything, we're going to need to know about each of those locations and have them in the database. Professionals or things that share an office, whether it's doctors or lawyers or accountants or beauticians, you know, a lot of times there'll be multiple private companies within one structure. Where do you license just this legal office, or do you license each different legal corporation that might be operating out of that legal office? Or a beautician might have 5 chairs, they run 1 chair and rent out the rest of them. Do each of the 5 beauticians need to be licensed, or just the salon? A lot of decisions that need to be talked through and decided as a council as we move into this. Examples of activities that you may want to consider exempting: residential rentals of less than a certain number of properties, religious or political organizations. Do you want them licensed? Do you want to charge them to be licensed? Do you not want to get them licensed at all? Like I say, a lot of decision. Casual activities such as yard sales. Do you license that? How about if it's 10 times a year? Do you license that? Or what if it's every other weekend? You know, these type of things. I mean, it's difficult as you try to flesh it out, because there are so many issues as you get into it. Farmers market. You have a farmers market come into town. Does everybody who has a booth have to get a business license? Transient merchant and peddler solicitors. Right now, we have a separate license for transient merchant and peddler solicitors that come in. How does the business license work into those transient merchant and peddler licenses? We also have a nonprofit show license. How do the people that show at those, how does the business license work into that? Newspaper carriers, you know, obviously, do you license each one of those? Do you license the Courier, local newspaper, who has deliverers in the community? What about the Arizona Republic that has people delivering? Again, fundraising events by different groups or different things around town. Just a lot of issues that we just need to figure out which way we want to go with the ordinance, and then start putting the ordinance together. Enforcement, as Councilman Lamerson was talking about, you know, people who don't want you to know aren't going to tell you, even if you have a business license. What is the penalties? Are they City Code Section 13-1, which is, I believe, a misdemeanor penalty, which is what the business license is currently? What's the penalty or enforcement for people who just failed to get a license, just don't do it? Or what if their license is revoked for non-payment of fees or something? What is the procedure? What is the level that council wants to proceed on those things? And what information are we going to get? You know, there's probably a fine line between information and every information you might ever want to know. If you don't ask it, if you don't require it, you're not going to have it. So obviously location, obviously ownership, contact information, those are pretty obvious. The NAICS code, what type of activity are they doing? What type of business activity? Maybe the number of employees. You know, maybe the square footage, maybe any hazardous materials, maybe, you know, there could be a lot of things. There's a lot of different things different communities ask on these things. And, you know, at some point a business owner might feel you're pushing a little too far into what's not city business. But again, that's what council will need to decide, what information we want to get, what information we want to track. Fees. We have, do you have
We have one question here.
Yes,
from,
sir.
Councilman Shiska.
I'm going to just say Mark. Mark, this is all well and good, and I have to be honest with you, I'm in favor of a business license fee. We're a long-time Prescott business. I think that we need to pay something for the privilege of doing business here in Prescott on a yearly basis. However, it seems like what we're talking about is a wash. You know, it's been said that it has to cover the expenses of the program. So my question is, if it's a wash, is this a difficult situation that is ultimately going to take so much of our time that it's not going to be a wash?
Well, I mean, you can always, the fees can always be set to recover the cost. Again, and I'm not trying to blow it out of proportion here. It's not undoable by any means, but there are a lot of decisions, and we don't want, you know, you say a business license, it might mean one thing to somebody and one thing to somebody else. You know, it all depends on how we structure it, how we plan to bring people into compliance and enforce the business license. The issue isn't really the cost, the issue is the data. Do we need the data as a city to help compliance with tax. Probably do. It would definitely help those things. But if it gets too big, it's easy for these type of things to grow. Well, what if we get square footage? What if we get number of employees? What if we get how they voted in the last election? Or, there's a line somewhere of all the data you want to get. So and that's why we bring it forward for public discussion, for consideration, and to get it all out in the open and make sure we are doing what council wants us to do with it.
Well, and I appreciate you saying that. It's been tried a number of times before over the years. Every councilman that I've talked to who's been a friend of mine has said, oh yeah, we tried it in our year. What is the biggest downfall in your estimation, and can we overcome that?
Again, it's up to council, and I know it's been tried numerous times. I've tried it numerous times over the last many years. The issue or the problem is whether people feel the information is necessary enough to inconvenience the businesses to collect it and to impose a fee. That seems to be where we boil it down to every time we try it. We go through the process, we build it like this, but then there's a significant concern of how it will be administered and how it will be used type of things.
Thank you.
So we'll try a very public process and hopefully get all the questions resolved. Fees, annual fee on a program, obviously looking back at a transaction privilege tax license that did not have an annual fee. A lot of cities, not most, but a lot of cities have an annual fee for their TPT. I think that's an important fact of it, because if it's just good forever, people don't take the time to actually update your information and keep it current. So it's not very useful. I might have information from 30 years ago that the only thing that's accurate is still a mailing address. I don't even know they're doing the same business. Some people used to sell bread and blinds. Now they only sell blinds. Different things out there. Obviously, a variable fee is an option as we get through this and decide how we want to do it. It could be on number of employees, on business class. Do you have an application and an annual fee? The process of licensing throughout the year. Grace period for implementation, any penalties for failure to obtain. And here's some examples of fees around us. Chino Valley has a license fee of $50. And then that's an annual fee, and then an application fee of $33 for the first time you apply. Prescott Valley has $60 to $65, deals with number of locations on that, and that's an annual fee. Sedona has a $25 fee. Camp Verde has a $50 initial fee and a $25 renewal fee. Peoria, $75 initial, $55 renewal. In Fountain Hills, $35 if you're located within the city. If you're outside doing business in the city, that's a $50. I thought that one was interesting. It's different than the way the others did it. Implementation of this is complicated. It needs to be done right. We don't want to inconvenience business owners by making it difficult, making it hard. We have to set up a tracking system, obviously through our computer system. Just an issue of time there. We already own the module because we're using it for tax licensing now, but there is a configuration and setup that will take time. Creating the web interface, you got to be able to do this online these days. Not everybody who works has a business in town is going to want to walk down to City Hall and hand in their license. They're going to want to be able to do it online. We got to establish the application once we decide what we want to track. We got to get mailing lists, do online campaigns to notify the people doing business here. For those few that don't watch our council meetings, won't be able to hear about it anywhere else. Notification, of course, we can outsource this, the mailing of the licenses and other media outreaches. Personnel requirements, we've talked about that. Not going to be a lot of personnel for the tracking of the licenses. The level of enforcement council wants to do could have more of a personnel impact. If you want, people walking the streets, making sure that every business they see is licensed, that's a different issue than we just take licenses at City Hall and track them. Obviously, with the state thing, there is a potential for reassigning current employees to the new duties as the state takes over collections. And the cost, of course, will be determined when council decides how we want to, the magnitude of the license as we implement it. We've thrown out some milestones here. Again, this is a preliminary meeting. That's the workshop that's listed there as the second, to kind of get it out there and start talking about it. We can plan to come back on the first workshop in March for some policy discussions, who we're going to license, that type of stuff, what we're going to collect. We'll take that policy discussion on the 1st of March and put together an ordinance to achieve that. Bring that back on the 5th of April for consideration. Again, if that ordinance needs to be tweaked, we'd need time to tweak it and bring it back. So that'd be May 3rd. If not, it could be adopted May 5th if it all came up right the first time. Ordinance would be effective 30 days after it was adopted. So if adopted on the 3rd, it'd be the 2nd of June. The implementation is a significant part of this. It has to be implemented well, and that is going to take at a minimum 6 months. I mean, that's going to be challenging with the staffing levels we have, because you probably want a budget for 17. You probably want revenues to still be coming in and all the day-to-day that needs to happen. And then we'd be looking at getting businesses licensed in December and January of 16 and 17. With that, I mean, we've had a lot of discussion, but we'll open it up for more discussion.
Okay. Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. Mark, my priority for moving forward would be to address potential demands on police, fire, and public safety as a whole. We went through an exercise here several years back with an alarm ordinance for those type of operations, whether it be medical or home or anything else, that put a demand on public safety, and that was by false alarms, whatever you choose to call it, define it. But where it necessitated dispatch of personnel. And that's a use fee. And a use fee, tax, whatever you want to call it, is a consumption tax. And I'm a firm believer in consumption taxes. You pay for what you use. You don't pay for permission to live here, but if you're going to use it, for example, if you're going to call the police out because you have a false alarm or you have an alarm, whatever the case would be, I can understand paying for that. If you're going to subject this community to hazardous material, you're going to subject this community to having hazardous materials in areas that can be kind of volatile, like in the downtown or in residential neighborhoods or whatever. You need to pay a use fee on that, because at some point you're going to take away from your neighbor because somebody had to respond to what you did. And that's going to cost the taxpayers as a whole. So I would like to, I personally, I'm not speaking for any of the other 6 because I never do that. I would like to see us moving forward looking at, from a consumption perspective, what are the things that can be identified that would put a demand on this city differently than just being here.
Councilman Lozelle.
Thank you, Mayor. Hi, I'm here from the government, and I'm here to help.
Yeah.
If you like your plan, you can keep your plan. It just seems to me over the past few discussions I've had, the majority of people that are in favor of this license is from the city government. To tell you the truth, I initially went into thinking about this totally against it. And then there were some good arguments, and I was kind of leaning, well, this might be a good idea. And I had a conversation with somebody yesterday I will not name, but we're concerned about the type of businesses we have here in Prescott. And we use lawyers, accountants, insurance agents. From my understanding, we have a state board or state bar. We've got a medical board. We've got insurance regulators that know how many insurance people are in town, realtors. I mean, there's a state board for realtors, state board for accountants, architects. I mean, all these professionals are already registering with the state or feds already. So if we wanted to maintain, retain that or get that information, I can look it up here. I just asked this, the businesses in Prescott, Arizona, it listed 10,000 businesses here. All of them registered with us doing TPT? Probably not. I just don't know how we're going to enforce it. Let's say I'm for it. How are we going to enforce this? You know, you have book editors working out of their house. You have medical transcribers working out of their house. Is that violating a zoning because they're using their computer? I store my tools for my business at my house. Am I now in violation for zoning for that because I have my trailer with my tools in it? Friends of mine are Amway or Mary Kay. Should they pay TPT? If they sold it in Prescott, I would say yes, but that's a different issue totally. I think we're broad brushing to capture a few and affecting, for the majority, every law-abiding citizen here, business owner, that has to put up with the IRS, State Liquor Board, County Health, OSHA. I mean, it goes to Corporation Commission. I got to do that annually. I got taxes. I've got accountants that I got to pay every year. And it's just one more thing that just is, as a business owner, it's death by 1,000 cuts. And as a representative to the people of Prescott, I didn't run on that to make it more difficult for the people in Prescott. So I can't support this.
Councilman Blair?
I get that, and I truly do. On the reverse side, I had a gentleman corner me yesterday that has several rentals here in the community, and he feels taken upon because he asked me a very specific question which had to do with seemingly 200 plus drug and alcohol living facilities, and asked the specific question, are these people being treated the same way I'm being treated? Are we collecting tax from these places that include bed tax and rental tax? And I had to answer him. I said, I have no clue. How many of these people that operate in the city of Prescott under the business auspices, how many of those do we have a clue that aren't paying their share? We're up against the wall with taxes in this community. We're talking about cuts here, cuts there. I agree with you 100% about nickeling, diming businesses to death, but I also believe that people that are operating within this community that owe their fair share need to pay their fair share. That's where I'm at. If we can devise that mechanism, then I'm good with that.
And Steve, I get what you're saying, and we do have unregistered group homes here. I got 2 calls myself about they haven't been registered yet. I let them know. So if there is something that if they're getting they're renting that place out, we can enforce that. We already have a rental, ordinance. As far as the, Mark, I have a question. When you get your TPT, is there not a $35 fire inspection fee when you get your business license? That the fire department is supposed to come already for the $35 and inspect your business?
There is a fire inspection fee. It's a one-time fee. So,
but that's on the books. And by the way, they never visited my wife's salon, her saloon. That's at my house.
That's
but
on
I
the
don't
weekend.
charge, so there's no TPT. But they never showed up until I brought it up, and then suddenly they were there. So there is an inspection already when you sign up as it is. It's $35 for this inspection, which she was in business for almost 6 years and never saw a fireman.
you're right, Councilman, there is a fee charged on TPT, not on obviously any other business that we don't have a license on.
And as far as hazardous chemicals, and I respect your viewpoint, Councilman Lamerson, but in my house as a private citizen, I have thinners, paint thinners, every type of solvent, because I like to build furniture as a hobby. I'm not selling it, don't worry about it. And okay, what if somebody's a hobby welder or reloads their guns? They've got gunpowder, they're not a business, they just reload. There are dangerous chemicals there. So I just can't agree with the argument by saying public safety, because suddenly if you say, I don't agree with that, then suddenly you don't care what happens to your town and you hate public safety. I don't buy that argument.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you. Be real candid with you, I don't care. You have your argument, I have mine. Fact of the matter still remains, I would like the penalty, in case you burn your neighbor up, to be so steep that you would take a look at what you do. This can be handled differently than licensing everybody in a blanket license. I mean, you know, at some level, you know, you have to take some accountability for having responsibility for what you do. And if what you do puts me in harm's way, I might just shoot you. I might. You never know for sure what I'm going to do.
That.
But depends on the circumstance, you know? Well, you know that. What your neighbor doesn't know is that you've stored a bucket full of hazardous chemical next door to him. And if you do something that causes his house to burn down, I want you to be held accountable. Absolutely.
Sure, we have civil court for that, Jim. They can do that.
And I understand that. But if you're going to keep that stuff in a residential neighborhood, the fire department has a right to know that it's there.
Councilman Shiska.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My question is, do we dumb down just because we're called Prescott? You mentioned a whole bunch of communities that already have this business license fee. So what's the difference? I mean, why can they do it and we just have this insurmountable obstacle of people who say, you're infringing on my rights? You know, I think that, you know, from my comment in the last meeting, you know, I'm all for being true to our American spirit, but let's get serious. We need to figure out why these guys can be successful and we can't seem to get over the hump.
Well, I guess I'll go ahead and say a few things here just to add to the mix. First of all, I think one thing we might want to look at is calling this revenue neutral. It seems like people kind of stumble around, you know, what are we talking about with a fee? So maybe revenue neutral would be one way we could explain it. Again, just like Councilman Shiska said, you know, we're not inventing the wheel or reinventing the wheel. It's already, you know, a lot of people are already doing it out there. I'm sure we can get a lot of understanding and expertise from other communities on how to develop this program and to make it effective. Again, I still feel that we want to look at minimum essential information. I'm not really sure that I see the number of employees or the size of a building or the total you know, retail activity of the you know, the amount that they make in a year is important in a registry. I think the big thing we're trying to do is understand what type of business we have in town, because you know, I think that's going to help us in economic development. You know, I said it in my letter in the paper on Sunday. We have businesses coming to this town that say, you know, what's my competition? Right now, we don't really know. Now we can go look through, you know, the phone book, and we can go online, and we can do all kinds of little searches on our, you know, our phones and see what we can come up with. But you know, I think there's a better way to do that. I think, you know, if it's important to know the number of people in a building for the fire department, maybe that's one reason why we would have it. You know, if we need to know the size of a building, so they determine if there is a fire, maybe the amount of apparatus that might be necessary to fight the fire. I don't know. I mean, I'm getting into an area that, you know, I'm not familiar with on fighting fires, but I'm sure that they can use some of this information. So I'm just saying that if we're going to have information, let's make sure it's useful and it's not onerous, and it's not getting into the business's personal decisions on how they run their business. I think the last thing I'd like to talk about is, and I'm probably going to go to City Council here, to have a business tax and to be fair with a business tax, do we have to have a business license so we can identify everybody and make sure that we're applying the tax fairly?
Well, Mayor and Council, the city charter, our city charter allows for a city to issue business licenses, and it also allows for the city to charge a business tax. And that the limitations are it can't be, our charter doesn't give us separate authority to charge us or to charge tax based on gross revenues or receipts or sales. The implication is that the tax has to be pretty much a flat fee, like an annual flat fee. It could be tiered based on the different size of the business or what the demands are on public safety, those kinds of things, but it's sort of a rational basis. But in my view, because they're, from a legal standpoint, because they're from the same section of the charter, in my view, the business license has to precede sort of the business tax if that ever happens. And I think from a practical standpoint, I don't know how else you do it. In other words, if you have a business license, based on some of that data you get on the application for the license, then you fall into a particular tier, say, for if a business tax were ever adopted. So in my view, yeah, they're mutually connected. I don't think you can separate them. One from a legal standpoint, and two, I'm not sure how practically you would charge any kind of business tax without having any kind of underlying license. For instance, TPT tax. You have a TPT license currently, and that's how we figure out who's doing which businesses are doing taxable transactions under transaction privilege tax. So I think the answer is yeah, they're connected.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else have any further comments? Okay.
If I can, Mayor, I kind of look at this as two different things, and I appreciate everything everybody said, but I look at one of them being an economic situation of people that want to conduct business in the city of Prescott, for them to know how many businesses, professional, lawyers, dentists, feed stores, jewelry stores, education institutions, a mass element that business that wants to locate from California to the city of Prescott wants to know how much this community has to offer. That's one way I look at it. The other way I look at it is the fact that I think that we're a siphon and we're losing tax revenues that we sorely need in this community. I was sitting here thinking while you were talking, Mayor, about the number of businesses that I know about, not that say that they are or are not, because I have no idea. But if you have a guy that's a roofer and his mailing address is his house and that's where his business phone is, and he is out there collecting tax from the public, question is he licensed, bonded, and insured? And is he taking taxes away that aren't being reported to the city? That would be my question. Because in the case of the drug and alcohol folks, not to pick on them, I would pick on everybody else just alike. If you're conducting business in the community and you're not paying your fair share, they need to be paying their fair share. So I look at this as two different ways. And I look at one way as an enforcement side of maybe auditing being done to look at people that aren't paying their share, as well as a business fee, so that we have a master list of all the people that are conducting businesses in the community, so that people that want to locate here know who is here.
Councilman Lozelle.
Thank you, Mayor. Steve, I agree with you that people do. If you're paying your fair share, I'm paying my fair share, and there's somebody under the table that is not. And I'm not going to pick apart every example, but I'm going to do it this time. Registrar contractors were already on that. I'm a registrar with registrar contractors, okay? So I'm licensed, bonded. If I was not, I wouldn't go get a business license, okay? So I think we're picking the low-lying fruit here of everybody that otherwise is doing everything correctly and above board. I don't think if you're below board with the registrars or TPT or any other agency, you're not going to get a business license. I just don't know how we're going to enforce it, go out when you have every agency out there, every registrar of contractors and I can't even name them all. If they can't catch them, how are we going to catch them for a $35 fee?
Mayor Pro Tem.
I can't say I disagree with Lozelle. Not with a straight face. For $35, you're not going to be able to enforce this. And if a guy's going to be a cheat, he's going to be a cheat. That's the way it works. But if you're going to do a license, I want everybody in town imposed upon, not just the people you can touch. And if you can't touch everybody in town, don't touch me.
Any other comments? Councilman Shiska?
You know, Jim, from a wrap my head around it standpoint, yeah, I agree with you. But from a realistic standpoint, you're never going to get everybody. I mean, that's just, doing business in town, we're not sitting back saying, gosh, you know, I wonder how we're being imposed upon because somebody might be doing business that's not doing what we're doing. I think we need to start somewhere. I mean, we got to make an effort at it, and we can't sit back and go, oh, gee, somebody might object, so let's just throw up our hands and say, forget it.
Okay, if there's no more questions or comments, what I'd like to say is we're missing two people here, two councilwomen to provide their input. But I think there's a sense from the board here that we want you to continue pursuing this and sticking with the schedule that you have established right now. Okay, we'll move on to the next item.
Item 1C, legislative update.
Everybody. Thank you, Mayor and Council. Thank you, Mark Woodfill, for all of your help handing those out and speaking all day today. So I'll take the mic. This is the 23rd day of the legislative session. You might recall last time I was here that there were about 800 bills introduced. There are over 1,100 bills introduced now. So obviously we'll be going through all of those that potentially have an impact on the city. I'd like to point to what was passed out by Mr. Woodfill. The first is a report from the Aaron's Company. That is the contract lobbyist that we're working with this year at the legislature. There's a simple one-page cover that sort of goes over what the Aaron's Company has been doing on the city's behalf at the legislature, obviously focusing in on the major items on the legislative agenda that the city council approved in December. And then also there is a report of about 53 bills that they're looking at and tracking. Some are good, some are bad, some are probably not going anywhere. If you have any questions about those, you can feel free to ask me, or we can bring those up on a future meeting if they aren't covered in the second item that was passed out. And that is similar to what you looked at last time. The exception is that we do have bill numbers for some pension, public safety pension obligation changes that are going to be up in committee tomorrow, as well as an additional bill related to the expenditure limit for cities and towns should they choose to make extra payments in a year. I'll just walk you through this again. House Bill 2107 is the Substance Abuse Recovery Homes Bill. We did not see movement on that this past week, although I think it's probably safe to say that there's a lot of discussion about these pension bills that are coming forward this week amongst the legislature. So we have 3 pension bills. Those are listed in red. Anything that's new on this sheet from last time, or also this is updated from what was in your packet. Things are happening every day at the legislature, so a packet that goes out a week ago is pretty much out of date the next day for legislative activity. Senate Bill 1428, Senate Bill 1429, and Senate Concurrent Resolution 1019 are the 3 pension system-related bills. 2 of those, the 1429 and 1019, are really sort of procedural bills that are necessary in order to place a portion of the pension modification bill on the ballot. 1429 is an emergency measure that would add that ballot question to the existing special election that was scheduled for the education finance in May of this year. The Senate concurrent resolution, again, it's a procedural item that places that question upon the ballot, and it references Senate Bill 1428, where the meat and potatoes of all of those system recommended changes are located, if you're looking for that. And page 2 of the report from the Aaron's Company goes through this in a much more simplified way than if you were to read the bill. So that does have some significant prospective changes, creating a tier 3 of the public safety personnel retirement system, and that would impact new hires according to the bill after July 1, 2017. It also would establish a new COLA structure for existing members and retirees, and that's really there's that small section of Senate Bill 1428 that does require voter authorization, and that's the reason for those two other procedural bills. As I mentioned, these three sets of bills are scheduled for a committee hearing in Senate Finance tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. I'm pleased to say that Mayor Oberg has been asked to speak at the committee hearing to point out the issues that Prescott is facing relative to our ongoing pension obligations. And obviously, we would recommend support for this. It was a major initiative on the council's legislative agenda this year. I would also point out House Bill 2512. That is somewhat similar legislation. Essentially, what it would do is allow a city or a town to make an expenditure limit exemption for any payment, like a one-time payment or one annual payment in excess of what we had budgeted for pension obligation. If for some reason we had excess funds or didn't move forward with a capital project, something like that, that would mean that we wouldn't have to, or we came into money. That doesn't generally happen in a city, but if it happened, you wouldn't have to cut expenditures in order to make that payment. It just provides flexibility for cities and towns to be able to do that outside of their expenditure limitation for that very specific purpose of making a payment to the pension unfunded liability. So it doesn't hurt us at all to have that pass. It does provide more flexibility to the city relative to the state-imposed expenditure limitation. Turning to page 2, there are 2 other bills that were added to this since last week. That is Senate Bill 1057, Crimes Culpable Mental State Requirement, introduced by Senator Kavanaugh. What that essentially does is change a few different requirements for a perpetrator. We now need to be charging them with intentionally breaking the law instead of knowingly breaking the law, which is problematic for an officer to have to figure out, did you intentionally break this law or did you knowingly break this law? It seems like a simple change, but it would require significant changes to our code and likely have some impacts to our public safety personnel as well as our legal department in trying to actually prosecute things and keep people from committing crimes in the city. The recommendation there is to oppose. And then House Bill 2517 is another regulation, business professions regulation restrictions, introduced by Representative Warren Peterson out of the Valley. This actually is really quite timely relative to your discussion today and relative to your legislative agenda. Essentially, it would require every city and town to go through every single regulation we have that could be considered a barrier to entry into the business market of your city. Things like a business license, things like a TPT license, potentially, things like a health and safety ordinance for sober living homes. If that is deemed to not have a strict health and safety and welfare requirement, the city could potentially be sued. We would have to eliminate that regulation. And it also provides that even if the city would win the lawsuit, we don't have any recovery action against the person that brings action against the city. So it's a pretty big impact as far as preemption of local authority is concerned. I'm sorry to say it did pass out of committee on a 3-5 vote last week. So the last page of this, I just would point out to try to kind of keep us on track. We'll always list the House bill number, the title, what the recommendation is, and then any previous council direction. So if you don't have concerns about the recommended positions here, that will allow me to move forward and take action if it's necessary. Again, sometimes these things don't make it into committee. Sometimes they're held in committee. There's a lot of different moving parts at the legislature. But these are, probably the more significant bills that we should be concerned about and watching, recognizing there are 1,000 other bills, and we're looking through those and always vigilant to make sure there's not a strike all or a strike or changes to the bill that would make it something that would rise to the list. With that, I would take any questions.
Any questions? Comments?
Just thank you for going, Mayor. It means a lot to this community.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any information right now, particularly on the ones that we support, the one that PSPRS and probably drug rehab being at the top. Have our state legislators signed on? Are they co-sponsors? Is there any need for me to ask them to sign on, or are we looking at having Barry Aaron talk to them and try and get their support, or have they already signed on?
Sure. House Bill 2107 obviously was introduced by Representative Noel Campbell, and he's been moving that through the process. Our other two legislators were on the Drug Rehab Recovery Committee that was held this summer and made their recommendation to move forward with this. I would also point out that the city of Scottsdale made contact late last week and said that they would also be signing in support of this bill moving forward. So that's helpful. They'll be talking to their legislators that are, obviously voters down at the legislature, and so it helps to have other cities signed on, and the League of Arizona Cities and Towns, as well as about 5 or 6 other organizations, actually signed in support of that bill when it was in the House committee. So it's a moving target, and so any hour of the day I might be contacting you to ask to do something, depending on where the scales are tipping at that point, and what it's looking like down at the legislature relative to that bill, as well as relative to the pension bills. I would point out that all 3 of our legislators are signers on those 3 pension bills, as well as quite a number of other senators and representatives from across the state. And I also did talk to the Prescott Chamber of Commerce today, and they are planning to sign in support of the bills, as well as talk to the Arizona Association of Chamber of Commerce Executives, which is about 40 chambers of commerce across Arizona, to support those bills.
Okay, and I think what I'd like you to do is, if you think there's it's appropriate for me to send thank you notes to anybody that's supporting us on these 2 bills, let me know, and I'll be more than happy to do that.
Great, thank you.
Councilman Chiska.
Thank you. Allison, it seems like the Senate seems to be the stumbling block when it comes to the recovery home situation. Do you know where Senator Pierce stands in this whole situation?
Well, Councilman Sischka, Senator Pierce was on the Drug Rehab Recovery Ad Hoc Committee that met this summer. That committee did recommend its support. That bill hasn't reached the Senate yet. We're always talking to our legislators. I do not have any specific commitments from the senator on that bill, but we have not asked specifically for a commitment as we're working through the House.
Thank you.
Any other comments, questions? Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
I think we have one more item.
Item 1D, discussion of the February 2nd, 2016 voting meeting agenda items.
Okay, I hope everybody's had a chance to look at the voting meeting agenda. Does anyone have any question, comments, corrections that they would like to make prior to the voting meeting starting at 5:30?
And Mayor, if I can, I'd like to sort of make a suggestion that this part of the study session agenda be somewhat limited to questions that staff may need to bring a response back at the later meeting. In terms of open meeting law, I think it's more appropriate to, if there are questions or information or other, to help you then later make on a decision, I would suggest maybe limiting debate on the issues until the later meeting, when the public is there and available for the debate and can comment. So this is really for more informational. The purpose of this part of the agenda is informational. Is there information you need, questions you have that can be addressed now, then to help you sort of discuss the issue later at the later meeting.
Okay. Based on council's suggestion, is there anybody that has, I have one person. Okay.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I would like to make one request from Mr. Woodfield that we have the exact amount of money that's left in the Parks and Recreation Impact Fee Fund before this evening's meeting. Thank you.
Any other requests for information or questions? Okay, thank you for coming, and hope you can come back at 5:30. We have an executive session that'll start here shortly downstairs. Thank you.